Amazingly, the 2020 election cycle is in full swing at this point. Virtually every notable Democrat really in the world has already jumped in. President Trump looked vulnerable a couple of months ago, maybe even doomed to defeat, and that was, of course, the lure that got them into the race. But things have changed a lot in the last 2 months. The Democratic Party's own wokeness has been the real factor. Watch.
An agency like ICE, which repeatedly and systematically violates human rights, does not deserve a dime.
This administration and this president are truly morally corrupt.
When your son looks at you and says, "Mama, look, you won," bullies don't win. And I said, "Baby, they don't, because we're going to go in there and we're going to impeach them."
So what would happen if the least balanced, most extreme members of the Democratic Party took over? Well, the president couldn't have scripted better. He may not have built a wall in the end, but his enemies are so terrifying to normal voters that it's helped him. His approval rating is rising. His reflection odds have improved as well. Author and columnist Mark Steyn has been watching all this and joins us tonight. So I'm starting to think that maybe Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and this Ilhan Omar are working for the Trump organization in some capacity. I mean, it almost seems like a setup. It's just almost too perfect.
Yeah, I think they're colluding with Trump, as we should say.
Good point.
And we need to investigate it. Basically, what is going to happen now is that the trajectory in the Democrat side of the field is that they're all going to drive each other even more woke. So you'll think that Elizabeth Warren is woke, and she'll make Kamala Harris even more woke. And in the end, they'll even succeed in woking Joe Biden. And they're all going to be made super hyper woke. Federal officials, policemen in effect, have discussed using the 25th Amendment because they think President Trump is mentally ill. And as Alan Dershowitz said, that's a judgment that should be made by doctors or secretaries or chiefs of staff, anyone, in fact, but a police agency. The question before the electorate is going to be, who is really the sane or the insane one?
Yeah.
The party that is proposing retrofitting every single 230-year-old colonial-era farmhouse in northern New England in order to make it compatible with the Green New Deal, the party that is committed to abolishing the Border Enforcement Agency, or the guy who's just there in the White House doing his job, even as he drives deep state lunatics to devise ever more absurd ways of trying to get rid of him.
So you got to wonder if there aren't big parts of the Democratic Party, even the Democratic Party, who are going to look at people like this screaming on CNN all day and think, you know what, this is too much for me. I mean, they could potentially break their party in half.
Yes, I think so, because if you look at what happened last time, they had a problematic and frankly rather unlikable candidate proposing relatively centrist or left of center policies in Democrat terms. This time round, you are going to have candidates who are taking extreme leftist positions. And the risk, of course, is, as with what happened to Ilhan Omar, that in crude identity politics terms, they check all the boxes, they do all the virtue signaling, so they seem kind of nice. And then you read 3 or 4 of their tweets and you realize, actually, this person isn't nice. And I think that's a real danger for the Democrats. Whereas Trump, by comparison, plays a sort of thug and a bully, and he tweets up a storm. But he's actually not unlikable in the same way that some of these Democrats are revealing.
Well, and his policies are basically moderate, which nobody ever says, but it's true.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Yeah. He's relatively centrist on that stuff.
For sure, by the standards of 2 years ago. Anyway, Mark Steyn, thank you very much for that. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Tucker.
Well, here's an update to a story we spent a lot of time talking about. The U.S. news media, as you remember, immediately seized the chance to brand a group of high school boys from a Catholic school in Kentucky, Covington, as villains, bigots who were targeting people on the basis of skin color. Well, it soon emerged that not only wasn't true, it was the opposite of what happened. But it didn't matter. Journalists continued to use their power to browbeat and bully the high school kids. Here's one among many examples.
Do you feel from this experience that you owe anybody an apology? Do you see your own fault? We looked at that video and thought about how it felt from the other's perspective. In other words, there were a lot of you, a handful of the others. There's something aggressive about standing there, standing your ground.
Something aggressive about standing there. And journalists weren't the only ones to make that point. The Covington students' own Catholic bishop condemned them as well. Now, that bishop has apologized for what he said. He's admitted that he was bullied into denouncing the boys and that he never even looked at the evidence about what they did. Larry Elder's radio show host from Los Angeles. We're always happy to have him on the show. He joins us tonight. So, Larry, you got to think, not just in the case of these boys, but in the case of anyone who's been called names by the media collectively and then found to be not guilty of the charges, how does that person get his reputation back?
Well, of course, the person doesn't get the reputation back. The accusation is made above the fold, page 1. The retraction is made deeper into the newspaper. Yeah. What happened here is what I call the intersection of Trump derangement syndrome and what Tom Wolfe, the author who wrote the book Bonfire of the Vanities, calls the media's incessant search for the great white defendant. Nothing better for the media than a white man who's perceived as privileged that they can malign. And that's what happened with Mr. Nick Sandmann. And later on, earlier this week, Tucker, it also happened to a friend of mine named Doug Adler, who used to be an ESPN commentator. 2 years ago did a match involving Serena Venus Williams, used the term guerrilla tactics, not G-O-R-I-L-L-A, but guerrilla as in guerrilla tactics. And a New York Times tennis writer named Ben Rothenberg puts out a post and accuses Doug Adler of racism. ESPN demands that he apologize. Adler happens to be white. And he does to keep his job. They still fired him, and for 2 years he's been battling a defamation lawsuit. Finally, he won it, got his job back, but the tennis sports writer at New York Times has not lost his job, nor has he apologized. Nor did anybody in the tennis commentating field come to Doug Adler's rescue. Not the McEnroe brothers, not Martina Navratilova. None of these announcers said guerrilla tactic is a normal term used to describe a tactic in a match. And he got fired, got maligned as a racist, just like Nick Sandmann got maligned as a racist before the facts came in. The intersection of Trump derangement syndrome and the incessant search for the great white defendant.
Well, that's a shocking story. Gorilla spelled G-U-E. The French word, nothing to do with the primate at all. It's a completely different word.
Nothing.
And he gets fired.
And Tucker, when ESPN approached him, he said what you said. He said, I didn't say gorilla as an animal. I said gorilla as in tactic. And they still fired him after he apologized. My goodness. Talk about hysteria. This is mass hysteria. It fit the script. This young man in D.C. was wearing the mega cap. He committed also the sin of being born white. And he was privileged. And so the media just ran with that, just as they ran with the story about Doug Adler. It's outrageous.
And nobody stood up to defend him. They were all cowards. They just looked at their shoes.
One tennis commentator did, named Rami Koenig. He is a South African commentator. Outside of that, nobody did. And Venus Williams could have stopped this in 5 seconds. I know she's busy, but my goodness, she could have stopped it in 5 seconds had she wanted to. Instead, she wouldn't comment. She just let him twist in the wind.
And wreck the man's life and reputation.
Right. And by the way, Tucker, he had a heart attack. His cardiologist said his heart was fine before the stress of being called an international racist for 2 years. And now he's gotten his job back with a settlement, but no apology.
You know, there really aren't many brave people left, which is part of the problem. You are definitely one of them. Larry Elder.
Well, thank you.
Again, it's always a blessing to have you on the show. Thank you very much.